I'm going to hand over to Nancy Roberts, who I'm extremely pleased has come all the way from Asia for this occasion. There we are.
Yeah.
Yes. And I am going now to hand over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've all had some coffee, because it's getting towards the end of the day, and I know people are drooping, but we'll try and keep it interesting, won't we, Bill? So I'm Nancy Roberts. I'm Production and Operations Director for Academic Publishing at Cambridge University Press. And I'm really here to talk about some of the challenges we've had as a very old and well-established publisher in kind of moving to the new world, and why we've engaged Bill to help us with that journey. So hope you find this interesting as a kind of publisher case study of what we're doing and why. So this is what we're going to talk about. A little bit about the press, just to give the context, because it is kind of important. And the ebook journey that we've been on. I'm talking really mainly about ebooks today, although we do also have, obviously, online journals as well. I'm going to talk about our XML workflow and why we reached a point where we felt it really needed to change. And I'm going to say right now that I'm not a technical person by nature, so I'm really talking about the business context here. Bill is going to talk about the technical aspects of what he's been doing for us, and I do have a content services representative who's from our technical team in the room, so if anyone has any pointy bracket questions, I'll defer to someone else, I think. We're going to talk a bit about what Bill discovered in his explorations around the press and what steps we're going to take next on our XML journey. So, Cambridge University Press, founded in 1534. Since I think the OUP representatives have gone, I will say we are the oldest continually operating publisher in the world, but there's some debate around that. We're one of the oldest continually operating publishers in the world. And we started in 1534. This is our letters patent from Henry VIII, which gave us the license to publish what was defined in the letters patent as all manner of books, which sounds really nice. So we got on with that, and it took us, I think, 30 years to publish our first one. We do a bit better than that these days, but it took us a while to get going. So obviously we've come quite a long way. That's over 400 years of doing books, many of which are still in print. So Cambridge University Press 2013 doesn't feel quite so clean. It feels a bit more like this. We've obviously gone on a very, very long journey in terms of our book program. And we've tried to be very innovative in the XML space and very early into it, and that's some of what we're going to talk about today, what that's meant for us. So our mission is to advance learning, knowledge, and research worldwide. We're a very complex global business. People always say to us, we're incredibly complex, but without the scale of a large, complex global organization. We're kind of small, but sprawling. We've got a lot of organic structures which have evolved over time in different ways for different functions in different parts of the world. So my department is primarily in Cambridge, but I have a team in New York as well, and in the future we'll have staff elsewhere. And there's publishing all over the world as well. We've got a huge backlist, as I've talked about. We have something like 35,000 books in print, going right back to those very early days, the 17th century and beyond. And we don't just publish in STM. In fact, you know, for an STM audience, I'm a slightly strange choice of speaker because we publish very little STM, actually, compared to most of the other publishers you've heard from today. Most of our backlist and most of our front list is humanities. And our STM books list is quite small. We have STM journals as well, but again, we're small compared to a lot of the other players. And that impacts because we have a very broad author base that we have to serve. So with the best will in the world, most of my humanities authors are not particularly interested in the world of XML and ebooks. What they care about is their printed book. And we need to serve their needs as well as the needs of the STM community and other communities who are more digitally forward. We are still a very print-focused organization. We only stopped printing books ourselves in the past year, and 80% of our revenue still comes from print on the book side, so we still really need to get the print right. So whilst we want to do exciting things in the digital space, we still need to make the books come out in print as well. This is just a little timeline of where we've gone on our journey. So 1997, we launched CJO, which is our Cambridge Journal's online platform. So that's been going a good long time, and obviously is a lot more sophisticated than the ebooks program. We made our first ebook in 1999, I'm led to believe, although that was before my time at the press. I don't know if anybody read it. I don't imagine they did. But nevertheless, we were trying and we were doing some research. In 2002, we moved to an XML workflow, and the principle of this workflow was that it was theoretically an XML-first workflow. So we've heard a lot today about the vision of having kind of XML as your source and pulling everything else from that, including the print book, the PDF, and everything else that you might need. And that's sort of what we were trying to do. In practice, it didn't really work like that, but that was the theory that we were working to. Let's work in XML and derive all our other formats from that. So that's quite a long time ago that we started that. In 2007, we launched the CBML DTD, so that was a proprietary DTD to our own specifications. CBO, our books platform, launched in 2010. It, at the moment, is PDF-based, and we're looking to make some changes to that. But again, even by 2010, we were still really concerned about the PDFs, and we were using the print PDFs to drive that platform. 2013, lots of things have been happening. So we've got 20,000 titles now live on CBO. We've got 10,000 live on Kindle, and we've moved EPUB generation into the production processes. So it used to be a post-production process. We would finish the print book, and then we would hand over to content services, and they'd make the ebooks for us. And this year, we've really been trying to change all of that. So you can see we've kind of been on the fringes of the digital space for a long time, but really this year we've accelerated quite hard. We've had a lot of activity in the past year or two around this. This is what we used to broadly define as our ebook strategy, although I think that's being a bit generous to call it a strategy. So really, what we used to say 2 or 3 years ago, I joined the press 4 years ago, and this was certainly the case then, was, do we have the rights for this book? Do we have any files? And does it fit with our strategy? Which we really just meant we won't publish onto CBO things like reference works because we wanted to maximize the print revenue. So if all of those boxes got ticked, we made an ebook. So what you can see from that is that it wasn't really strategic, if we're being honest, because if we didn't have the files, we didn't go off and make them in most cases. So if we didn't have XML, if it was an older book, we simply didn't bother. So it wasn't market-driven in any way. It was very much about what we could do, and we did that, and we didn't worry about the rest of it too much. I hope you can see this all right. It's quite small. This is the workflow that we were using. So the manuscript would go offshore to be coded, to be tagged. And again, this was the theoretical start of our XML workflow. So the idea was we would hand over the Word document to the vendor. They would generate the XML. And in theory, the XML would drive all the other processes. In practice, of course, that's not what happened. The vendors would generate XML from the Word document, give us back the TypeScript, give us back some XML, and then the two would migrate away from each other as the process continued. Probably some of them weren't even generating the XML at the first stage because we didn't used to ask for it back then. So we'd get back a normalized TypeScript, which was supposed to be the same as the XML, which the copy editor would then use. That would go back to the vendor for page layout, again in the theory that the XML would be marrying up with the changes made to that TypeScript. We'd get the page PDFs, we'd go through the usual correction cycle, approve those, and then we'd order final XML. And again, the theory being the final XML should really be ready because it's been driving the process all the way through. What we found in practice was we'd get the print PDFs back, and then 3 months later we'd still be chasing for the final XML, which kind of proves the point that they were not using the XML to drive the process. So anyway, we'd get our print PDFs, send them off to the printer, and the XML we'd pass to our colleagues in content services, and they would generate the EPUBs for us. So there was a number of scripts built around our specific DTD that were then taking that XML and generating EPUBs and delivering them out on our behalf. So that was well, it's the world we're still in to a degree, but it's the world we're trying to move away from. Lots of benefits to this, obviously. We've got lots and lots of XML, tons of it, because we've been doing this, as you've seen, for quite a long time. And it meant we got into the ebook market quite early, as we've talked about. And content services developed a lot of tools and automation around the CBML. So we had our own EPUB conversion scripts. A lot of the typesetters had automated processes built around our CBML DTD. And obviously that meant we've got good internal knowledge of that structure. So, lots of good things about the way that we went about it, but a few challenges as well. The speed to market is an issue, as I've just touched on. Quite often we were always chasing after the event for the XML to come in. The complexity of the DTD, because it became an iterative process where we were constantly adding new elements to that and refining the way that we were using it, there was an administrative burden to that for somebody to kind of manage that DTD, inform all the vendors of updates, to make sure the vendors were actually then working with the new DTD and not reverting to the old one. And it meant it's quite hard for us at the moment to take on new typesetting vendors because the DTD takes such a long time to learn and get used to that, in fact, it's not really worth it for us to train someone up. So we kind of got stuck in a cycle with the same vendors. And of course, as a buyer, that's not ideal because they all knew that we couldn't easily move the work around. So you're not in a kind of really good buying situation there. And the highly automated processes, while it was fantastic and cost-effective, obviously led to a loss of control. So we would find that weird things happened in the course of these processes because it was going through an automated process rather than somebody looking at it. I've talked about the differences between the XML and the print versions. Other people have talked about version control today. That's something we've certainly suffered from. And we continue to suffer from it because most of our authors care more about the print book than they care about anything else still. So when they receive their print book and they find mistakes, they want to correct that for the next reprint. And we can't make them understand the difficulties that that causes us in terms of the ebooks we've distributed out to the world that can't be just pulled back and resupplied because we've got vendors, we've got intermediaries in the way, we don't know where these books are. So we had these quality concerns as well. I mean, we found for a short period, we were allowing Amazon to convert to their proprietary format on our behalf, which was a bit of a mistake, it turned out. So they would, for example, simply push things through their own automated conversion service and then make it live. And then customers would come back to us and say, I bought this book on, ancient Greek, and all of the text is rendered as euro signs or dollar signs because it couldn't cope with the typography and the scripts that we were using. And we just wondered whether the DTD was stagnating because we were always managing it internally and we weren't really looking outside of what was going on. So we reached a point where we just thought we had to review all of this, and this was mainly driven by the move from B2B to B2C supply of ebooks. So when we had an institutional platform and we were putting up PDFs, obviously, A, we had lots of control, and B, we knew who was reading the books and who was accessing them. When we moved into the customer world, you start getting a lot of complaints about the quality, and customers don't complain to Amazon when they don't like their book, they tend to complain to us, or if they complain to Amazon, Amazon forward it to us and say, what have you published? It's no good. So there was really a transition there. And as I say, I mean, we were sort of victim of our success in a way, because when no one was reading our ebooks, we didn't know that there were all these quality issues, and ignorance was bliss. And as soon as people bought their Kindles and started buying them, we started uncovering all of these problems. And of course, the market's quality expectations change as well. You'll all have experienced this. When you first got your Kindle, you kind of overlooked some funny formatting and bits of text that got larger and smaller for no reason and things. But very quickly, your expectations move on. We also obviously reached a point where we wanted to be more strategic about our ebooks and less scattergun. So we didn't want to just do it if we had the XML but not otherwise. We wanted to do things which might sell. We wanted to make sure our print bestsellers were available. And we needed to think about how we could do that for those instances where XML was a challenge. We're also just launching a project to I don't like the word re-architect, but I'll use it because there doesn't seem to be a better one, our platform. So we're bringing the journals and books platforms together, and we really want to maximize all of that content so that users can come onto the site and find both book and journal content and use it. At the moment, they get pushed to the other site. So if they're on the book site, they get pushed to the journal site. It's not an integrated experience. And that obviously gives us opportunities to make more of all that content. And sales and marketing have been very clear in their requests that we publish the print and the ebook at the same time. That's, they say, what the market wants and expects. And of course, with the post-production process where we were chasing XML and then we had to convert it and then we had to resolve all the problems, potentially going back to the XML, that was a very difficult thing to do. And like everybody, we need to manage down our costs. So the situation where we couldn't easily move our typesetting work around was becoming a major issue. We can't go out to tender because we know it's going to take someone a year to learn the DTD and all the complexities of it and build the tools around it that our vendors have. And we don't want to be in that situation anymore. We want to work in a more competitive way. So we reached a point where we needed help. So we got help. And I was going to take a show of hands for which one of these you think Bill is, but I'll be kind and I won't do that. So I'm going to hand over to Bill now, who's going to talk a bit about the work that he did with us and what he discovered.
As Nancy said, they brought me in really not to look at the whole picture. Specifically, my remit with them is looking at this XML model that they're using and help advise them how to evolve that XML model. But I'll have to say that, in the context of doing that, it was important for me to see how they're using the XML model and how it fit into their workflows, et cetera, to be able to advise them properly. So, and as Nancy said, our role here was to describe particularly why Anthony wanted us to team up on this, is this issue of taking a very well-established press, very well-established workflow, and transforming it. And it is, in fact, very difficult to do that. I actually am quite familiar with what Cambridge has been doing over the years. I've always actually quite admired them because they actually were a pioneer in doing a lot of these things much earlier than most other presses. So first thing I'm going to do is just deal with some of the issues that you deal with psychologically in moving ahead. Because sometimes, you know, something that you really, a tool that you really love and you've gotten so comfortable with, at a certain point you just have to let go of that tool. So I don't know how many of you have remember the good old Selectric typewriter, but it's like, how could that possibly be improved? That tool is kind of the ultimate typewriter. So how can a typewriter get any better than this? Well, when it isn't a typewriter anymore. That's the solution. So that's when this kind of thing came along. And we had a whole different way of interacting with our content. It was very revolutionary, huge revelatory thing. It was still beige, but oh well. And that itself evolved, right? So, I mean, here this was the iMac that is credited as saving Apple, and in fact, it saved Steve Jobs. This is when he was brought back into Apple and they created this. It was so revolutionary and it made such a huge impact. So that's the coolest thing. Well, how cool does that look to you today? Not very. Anybody remember what this is? I hear a couple of people that actually do know what this is. That's the Next. That was what Steve Jobs did in his hiatus from Apple. And it was a brilliant technology. Everyone agreed that it was, you know, light years ahead of its time, but guess what? It didn't succeed. If it doesn't work in the ecosystem, it doesn't work. So he had to let go of that as well. So now specifically to Cambridge. They've been in the vanguard for 500 years. Okay, that's what we're dealing with here. So here's some recent examples. They were very early in STML. They're very early in copy editing with Word. They're very early in doing automation with scripts in their workflow. They had an XML-based workflow before almost anybody else did. They know how to use schematron. Many of you may not even have heard of schematron, but that's actually intrinsic to their workflow. I have to most often counsel my clients to think about using schematron. They already are using schematron. And doing EPUB. So my point here is that they're actually quite advanced in what they're doing. They're ahead of most other publishers in how they do their work, and yet they're reaching a point in their evolution where they say, but wait a second, then why isn't this working as well as it's supposed to be working, right? We've got this well-automated workflow, we've got this XML, how come it's taking so long to get our EPUBs out, and how come we're so unhappy with them? Wasn't our XML supposed to make them automatic? And I think that was the attitude. So the assumption was there's something wrong with our XML. So I'll go in a little more detail over something that Nancy's already gone over, which is the evolution of XML at Cambridge. They started out in the 90s with HTML headers, moved to full text in 2001. Notice how early this is in all of this. Mid-2000s, they moved to XML with this CamML model. That evolved into CJML and CBML, which are the journal and book models, both based on an LM. So they are evolving this model. It's not a situation where they've got an old model that they made 10 or 15 years ago and then they just stuck with it. They've evolved this model over time. As Nancy mentioned, the CBML, which is the book side, which is the side I was dealing with, and that she's dealing with, needs to be updated, is being updated frequently, and it's updated as needs are encountered. And this happens particularly in the book environment because there's so much more diversity in the book world than there is in the journal world. Things come up that you haven't encountered before, and particularly with a list as diverse as Cambridge's. Another interesting milestone was just this year when CJML became CUP JATS 1.0. So the journals have moved all the way to a fully up-to-date JATS-based model. So the question is what to do about CBML. has it gotten too complicated? It's a very complex model, very modular, lots and lots of things, very expressive model. Frequent updates, and I mean frequent, every 2 to 3 months they're reissuing this DTD. So you can imagine what havoc that plays with, with their suppliers, et cetera, that you have to deal with a new DTD every couple months. The changes may be minor, the changes are very well documented, they have very smart, very professional XML people in their content services department, so they know what they're doing. But because of the way this DTD is created and the way it's structured, they're having to actually literally reissue it way too frequently. And of course, these EPUBs that were supposed to be automatic turned out not to be automatic. And actually, they began to question, have they over-automated? And wondered, isn't there a better option out there now? Well, I will say that several people from Cambridge, I think you were here last year, weren't you, Nancy, to hear you were not, but several were here to hear my talk last year. Many of you were here. So, the assumption was, here comes XHTML to save the day, right? I was a big advocate, am a big advocate of this XHTML-based strategy. So I will say that I think it's fair to say that when Nancy engaged me in this, the expectation was that's the strategy I was going to recommend to them. Well, let's step back and look at what were the problems and what is the best way to approach this. So first of all, it was very clear as I first delved into this that the issues were not all due to the XML model. The question of whether it's gotten too complex, the reason the model is complex is that their content is complex. They publish a huge variety of things, educational content, complex drama, all of Shakespeare. They publish legal stuff. They publish educational stuff. It's linguistics, all kinds of stuff. It's very complex. So the reason the model is complicated is that what they're publishing is complicated. What about these frequent updates that they have to manage every 2 or 3 months? Well, there are ways to do that without having to reissue your DTD every 2 or 3 months, and I'll get to that in a minute because it's part of why I recommended what I did. The files in the repository are inconsistent. That definitely is an issue because since this XML has changed over time so often, that XML that was created a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, no longer conforms to the current model. So it is true that some kind of remediation of that legacy XML probably is going to have to be done, whatever model the new model becomes. And then what about these automatic EPUBs? Why aren't they working? Well, one of the things that was happening was that in the interest of making EPUBs that, quote, work everywhere, they were creating lowest common denominator EPUBs that, I will say, even work in a Kindle, e-ink Kindle, okay? Well, the problem with this is that their books have features that need to be represented in ways that that lowest common denominator format can't do. So the solution, the problem with those EPUBs primarily wasn't that their XML model was problematic. It was that they needed a strategy that used EPUB 3 with appropriate fallbacks to EPUB 2. So that I think is, and again, this is all a work in process right now. We're going to have to see where we get with all of this, but at least that's the strategy I'm recommending, is to not dumb down the content, but accommodate those less capable reading systems through well-engineered fallbacks. And then have they over-automated? Boy, I was quite in admiration of their automation. They're doing so much that most publishers that I work with would die to have the sophistication that they've already got at Cambridge. Like, don't throw that out the window. You've got some really good workflow there. So what did I end up recommending? Bits. And I know that that's going to surprise folks that heard me being such an advocate of XHTML last year. I know it surprised the folks at Cambridge that weren't expecting me to recommend that. But let me explain why we went that way. And by the way, just for those of you that aren't familiar with BITS, BITS is the book interchange tag suite that is the counterpart to JATS, which is the journal article tag suite. JATS is pretty much universally being moved to in the journal world. BITS is not quite official yet, but it should be this month. And we actually have, the model is final. We have the final model. We know what the final model is. What needs to be done at this point is simply the bureaucratic stuff involved in getting it out as an actual formal 1.0 standard. So if anybody says, wait a minute, BITS isn't finished yet, it's actually finished, it's just not released as a 1.0 quite yet, but stay tuned, in the next few weeks it will be. So why was this right for them when a lot of what I was arguing for last year appeared to be what they needed, which was this switch over to an XHTML-based strategy? Well, first of all, it's designed for scholarly and STM books, and specifically for publishers that use JATS. It's exactly dead on for the Cambridge situation. Below the chapter level in a book, the markup is identical to JATS markup. That's really compelling when you want to publish book and journal content in an interoperable way, which is what they're just moving to do. She mentioned that they're now creating a single platform instead of the CJO and CBO platforms. They're going to have a single unified platform for books and journals. Having the book markup and the JATS and the journal markup be virtually identical at that textual level is an incredibly compelling argument. The model is built for adaptation. It's got all kinds of useful features that enable them to capture all the kind of semantics and specific vocabularies that they have, that has made their current model so complex. But those are captured in a way that the BITS and JATS model is designed to be adaptable for specific need content like that without having the DTD itself have to be reissued because it's done through attribute values. And also, it's an extremely modular model. Their current model is already modular. So in terms of making the transition from their existing model to a new model, it's going to be incredibly more straightforward for them to do this than if they were to have tried to use an XHTML-based model. They basically would have had to duplicate the complexity of their current CBML model expressed in XHTML, and they wouldn't have gotten all the other advantages that they'll get by moving to BITS instead. Totally facilitates book and journal interoperability, like I said. And finally, the thing that I found most compelling is that the automation is part of the DNA of how Cambridge works. They have an enormous number of scripted processes, scripted QA, scripted preparation of files, transmission of files, et cetera. Their vendors use the same scripts that they do, et cetera. So in an environment like that, you need a very rigorously structured set of content because everything has to work very predictably when it's being done by a highly automated tool set and a highly automated workflow. XHTML can be done that way, but frankly, one of its most important virtues is its flexibility. But the very flexibility that you get impairs the ability to automate to the degree that they're automating. I don't want to make too much of that point. It's a fine point because certainly you want to be able to automate in either strategy, and I'm still absolutely an advocate of the XHTML strategy. I don't want to leave the impression that I'm backing off on what I said last year about XHTML. XHTML is still going to be central to their workflow. They're producing EPUBs. They're rendering content online. All of that is HTML. But it's because of the nature of their environment. They're in a scholarly publishing universe. They interchange with scholars and scholarly publishing organizations, all of whom speak now, or NLM and now JATS and BITS. And their internal processes and structures and systems are already aligned with that model. It just made all the sense in the world for them to stick with that. And one issue that was an important issue for them at the outset was their current highly proprietary model locks them into a very small number of vendors that they've had to train to use this model, and another vendor looking at it would say, wow, this is going to take a while to learn. So they're trapped, basically, with certain vendors. Because at its heart, BITS is really the same as JATS, the kinds of vendors that they're working with, which are the vendors that most of you work with as well. They produce a lot of the scholarly journal and scholarly book content throughout the world, are all completely familiar with that model. In fact, it's arguable that that's the model they're most familiar with, is the NLM, historically the NLM model. So it's all in how the adaptation is going to be done, but because at its heart, it's basically the same model that all those comps already know and already have systems built around, it's actually going to be easier for them to find people that can adapt to it than if they were to have created a highly CUP-specific instantiation of XHTML that they would have had to then give to that vendor community to use. So what are some of the lessons from this? Well, the model that's right for somebody else may not be right for you. You know, I'm still a big advocate of the XHTML strategy. Many clients that I advise have moved in that direction and are very happy with it. But when we looked at the whole ecosystem, the whole structure at Cambridge, it was really clear that that wasn't the right thing for them, that BITS was. It would have been easier for me to recommend XHTML because that's what they expected me to, that's probably what they were hiring me to recommend, to be perfectly blunt about it. So I really threw them for a loop when I didn't recommend that. Another important lesson, it's not all about the model. I mean, fundamentally, with many of the existing models, XHTML, NLM now JATS BITS, DocBook, DITA, et cetera, you can express all these same things. So it's really how you use the model and how it integrates with your workflow that's the most important factor. This is a lesson that I want to stress, even though it's a lesson that CUP already learned, but many people that have gone with XML out of the expectation that it ensures that your content is consistent and correct are then shocked later to find out that they've parsed their content, it's all valid XML to their DTD, and yet it's still full of inconsistencies, so when they try to create ebooks from it, they've got a mess on their hands. And the reason is that that's insufficient to truly quality control your content. You actually need, ideally, you need 3 methods. What parsing is what's called grammar-based validation, which says, does this content conform to the model that I designated? Schematron is a technology that you can think of as rules-based validation. It's, you know, is this thing used properly in this particular context? It's a very context-aware validation. So it tests for things like business rules and usages that parsing can't help you with. And then a third QC aspect is a CSS that allows human inspection of the content in a browser. And that's actually an important part of it too. So using all 3 of those things is really important, and you can't rely on just one of them. Another thing is that I obviously think that their strategy of depending on vendors and treating them as partners is really a good strategy and a very appropriate strategy for Cambridge. But I think I want to stress that there are certain things you don't want to leave to your vendors. There's certain essential things that you want to own. So your particularly when you're working with multiple vendors, even if it's 2 or 3 or 4 vendors, you want to own your specifications. If you've got a Word template that's the basis of your workflow, you need to own that Word template. And however you adapt the model, even if you hire somebody to do that for you, you can hire one of your vendors to do that, but you own it. It's not theirs. And why I stress that is that, oops, I should go back. While they appear to have a very centralized and well-managed, and do have a very well-managed workflow, very well-managed relationships with the vendors, there were certain instances where they, in effect, inadvertently handed off things to the vendors to do that the vendors then did inconsistently. And so now when they get the books processed by those vendors, the inconsistencies crop up, and they may not discover that until they're trying to make their EPUBs, because, again, these are valid XML files, or they wouldn't have gotten them. But by the time they get to their EPUBs, they say, whoops, wait a minute, what's going on with this thing? So making sure that that kind of adaptation is done, is centralized and controlled by you is really important. Another thing, particularly in this Pioneer's Dilemma theme, is that things that were really great features early on can actually become impediments later. One of the things that was really cool about the Cambridge word editing process is that when they create the manuscript for the copy editor, and basically they have the vendors do this normalization of the Word files to their model, and then those normalized files go out to the copy editor. So the copy editor gets clean files that all look alike. And in addition, they've got little boxes by all the elements with the style names actually rendered on the page. So this is really cool, right? Well, it was really cool when most of their editing was done on paper. And they had to have those little labels on the page to show the copy editor what it is. But a tiny percent, there is still some done on paper, but it's a very small percent. And what's happening is that those style boxes are actually not working properly in an online environment. So when the copy editor, for example, changes a style name, or restyles an element, the box doesn't change. Well, now, why is that? Shouldn't it change? Well, it's because it's actually a separate process that's done by the vendor when they're creating those files. So now the copy editor's got the file, and they change it, the little box doesn't change. Or they add a line, and the box doesn't move. And so now they've got misleading tagging information on their file. So even though that thing was cool as heck when they created it and essential to how it worked, at this point they need to get rid of those damn style boxes. Sorry. There are better ways of rendering that markup than those style boxes. And one last, I think the second last, is that oftentimes people think that the solution to something that is complicated is to cut stuff out, leave things out. Simplification, right? Well, oversimplification can cause problems. So, for example, in the interest of not burdening the copy editors with the full complexity of their model, the Word template only renders a subset of the actual XML that needs to be in the files. So what this happens is that the copy editor is theoretically rendering something that is going to become the finished file, the master file as it moves on, but the typesetter, when that is received from the copy editor, puts in a bunch more codes that the copy editor couldn't do. So now you've got this invisible part of the process that's being done manually in a process that appears to be totally automated. So actually, they'll be better off getting everything into the Word template so that they get complete XML that goes to the typesetter, and the typesetter isn't futzing with it. That's very dangerous, that the typesetter is futzing with that XML. And another one, I think I already talked about, this lowest common denominator EPUBs. I can see exactly what the logic was there, is to make it simple, make it work everywhere, but the problem is it was giving them bad-looking EPUBs everywhere, and it was not satisfying their customers. So that intention to simplify wasn't actually a good strategy in the long run. Now that we've switched it to my presentation, we need our friend back to switch it back to her presentation. Sorry about that. I shouldn't have insisted on that. But any questions while he does the switch here? Do you mind if we take some questions in between here? And by the way, one thing I really want to emphasize is I'm very impressed with Cambridge University Press. You know, I felt a bit awkward being asked to do this presentation because here I am talking about things that I found one of my clients doing wrong that they should do better. And it's like, well, I don't want to get up and make it sound like they're not a well-run press. They're extremely well-run press. I'm very impressed with what I see there. Sure.
I am paying him to say that, obviously. So just to finish off, really, obviously, after Bill dropped his little bombshell and recommended bits, that caused us to stop and think quite hard, having expected a nice report recommending XHTML. So we had some internal discussions around that. We decided that we do want to go down this route for all the reasons that Bill's just articulated. So we're putting together a project team from across the business to implement this. And I emphasize that because I think it goes to what Bill's talking about. We started off thinking this was really a question about our DTD, and actually it's a question about almost everything that we do that revolves around that DTD, our production workflows, our copy editorial workflows, our EPUB workflows, everything hangs off this. So it's become much bigger than simply thinking about, do we have the right model and do we need to change it? We're actually taking the opportunity to change the whole way that we do the production around this. And the goal is all of these things. So the challenge, but also the goal, is to kind of change the engine while we've got the plane in the air. So my team generates 1,600 new books a year. So whatever day I choose to move from one model to the other, there's going to be 600 books in production that are going to be stuck between the old world and the new world. So we've got to really think through how we do that. And the inevitable consequences, some things are not going to transition across to the new model, and it's going to take time for us to really get into the new model. We want to try and go live in May 2014, really because it's the start of our financial year, so it's a convenient date for us to choose. And as I say, spend the rest of 2014 streamlining all those surrounding workflows that sit around our DTD at the moment. That's both us and the vendors that we work with. And obviously, you know, we've all shared our vision for how all of this should work. And our vision is really to try to get to this repurposable, cross-searchable content that we thought we were getting when we went into an XML workflow the first time. And for all the reasons we've talked about, we sort of got, but not quite in the right way. So that's where we're going to try and get to the point where our book and journal content is operating the same way, can be viewed on the same platform, can be cross-searched, can be linked together, and that we're getting really good quality EPUBs out for the moment, but if some new format comes along, hopefully we can get that out as well. And we've still got the reliable print PDF and online PDFs as well coming out of this process, because we're still serving that print community. And then we'll celebrate. Okay,
now some questions. Got 10 minutes. Questions? Yes, I can see a question sitting over there. Poor Jo hasn't started down the steps until now, yes, but she'll get there. Thanks.
Hello, Heather Flanagan, RFC editor. So you mentioned you're going to be making these changes and changing the engine while the airplane's in the air. Can you summarize how are you going to do that?
Can we summarize that? Do I need to push it?
It's on.
It's on. I'm not sure. I mean, I think what we'll have to do is nominate a date for the transition and specify at what stage in the process a book would need to be to move into the new model. So there's going to be a point where a book is too far through the process to transition to the new model. Now, that may be when it enters production, it may be, if it's at proof stage, we still think we've got opportunities to do that. We haven't really worked that through yet. This is all really pretty early days in the process, so we're thinking more this week about the implementation, but it is going to be a big challenge, and we are going to find problems in that, I think, given the volume of content we have live at any moment. But we're simply going to have to draw a line in the sand and designate what's on one side of that line and what's on the other.
And the other thing I'd add there is keep in mind that they have thousands of backlist books, so that are produced in the current model or a predecessor to the current model. So whenever they make that switchover, the books that are already in process at a certain point just add to that backlist of books in the old model.
Yeah.
Rather than necessarily pulling the rug out from under a book in the middle of production that's in one model and making it use another model, which is probably not a good way to do the transition.
Yeah, and we've already, you know, even in the kind of week or so that we've been thinking about this, or couple of weeks, we've already come across some pretty major decisions that we need to start taking around this. The one that you've just articulated, what do we do about the backlist? Are we actually going to go through and do something with all that existing XML, or are we going to live with the fact that it's in the old model and just try and identify which is in which model, which is a nightmare in itself for us because of the iterations we've had of the DTDs and so on. So, you know, even in the first few days of thinking, yes, we want to do this and this is going to be great, we're already crashing up against some really big decisions and, you know, struggling to think about how we're going to make them. So it'll be an interesting journey, I think.
I guess I will add another point. I mentioned that one of the things that I think they're doing really well is the way they have a really good partnering relationship with their vendors. So this is something where collaborating with their vendors on this issue is going to be very important, and particularly in this case because unlike most workflows, they have their vendor dealing with a given title right up front in the workflow before it even goes to the copy editor, because they're the ones that are normalizing the file. So collaborating with those vendors to say, when's the best point in this workflow to make this transition, I think the vendors will have something to say about that.
Anybody else got some questions? Anybody who's been through something like this? Because I haven't actually heard a description of something quite like this, where somebody had gone so far down the XML line and got used to it and then has had to do massive changes. I never heard this before. It's rather exciting, isn't it, really, people? But has anybody else had any experience of something not unlike this, like a complete rejigging of their whole XML procedures and so on? No?
No, everyone's feeling very
they
happy.
They don't say it.
Built
They probably,
workflow
oh, there we are. Richard has a question. Richard's a good man. He's a vendor. He's okay. He can get away
Hi,
with
Richard
this.
from Aerie Systems. This is a dumb question, but why is HTML5 incompatible with bits? They seem to be orthogonal ideas, but
It's not. They will still have XHTML5. In other words, this is a workflow issue. So for their workflow, which goes all the way back to the copy editing stage, and for their management of content in a joint book and journal repository where all the journal content is in JATS, it's just really, really compelling to have all of that in just JATS and bits. But their model, and particularly when this new bits implementation is done, it will be done with the transform to XHTML in mind in the first place. So it's not at all incompatible with it. It's just that the bits is a better fit for their particular workflows and their particular infrastructure and situation. They're still going to have EPUBs, and they're still going to have XHTML. In fact, all of the content, the content that you folks send out to Adapon and Highwire and Publishing Technology, et cetera, all of whom are pretty much NLM dominated, when you're looking at that content online, you're looking at HTML. So NLM is being transformed to HTML all day, every day. Millions and millions of files are being transformed to HTML all the time.
I could ask a question, because a few years ago, after I'd retired for the first time from this, and Suzanne Wilson-Higgins did a most marvelous program. I don't know if anybody was here, but it was wonderful. But one of the people speaking was one of your predecessors. I can't remember his name, but he seemed very different in his approach to offshore vendors, offshore suppliers, than you seem to describe, because he seemed to suggest it was absolutely crucial to hold everything in-house, which was at all important, and keep total control over things, in a way which the Elsevier and Springer people who also spoke didn't seem quite so worried about. Have I misunderstood this?
No, I mean, I think it comes down to what you define as important, actually, at any particular point. And I think what we've realized really is that a lot of the automation and the work that the vendors were doing for us was actually things that we consider quite important and we probably shouldn't have given away. And perhaps when we gave it away, we thought that the sort of technical DTD management and using that model was the most important thing, and that the vendors were the right people to do that because they had the technical skills. What we're actually finding now is what we care about as publishers is what does it look like when the reader gets it? And that's some of what we'd given away in this old model. And that's what we want to get back. I want my production editors looking at the content and saying, yes, this looks good, because that's what they do in the print world. And they spend hours and lots of money and time doing it. And then we were losing some of that benefit. So I think we've transitioned into what we consider important now. We want to get that same level of quality into the ebooks around the design and the usability. And that's some of what we gave away in terms of perhaps thinking that we could cede control of that to the technical people in the vendors.
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the things that that's a real benefit of the high automation in their workflow, because even today with their current model, they're actually inspecting EPUBs at first pages from the typesetters, because they've got that XML and it's an automated process to create their EPUBs. So they get a very early advanced look at their EPUBs. Yeah. And certainly with this new model, when it's evolved and perfected, and all the scripts are updated, et cetera, what they'll be doing is, I mentioned the QC CSS. That's an HTML-based technology. So, but it's based on the fact that they've got this highly rigorous model and highly scripted workflow that enables them to do that. So they aren't manually tweaking stuff to look at it. They're transforming and inspecting, but they're not futzing.
Yeah, and we're looking at the EPUB and the page proofs in the same way now. So in the old world, we would expect the production editor to have gone through the page proofs, and checked that everything was as they expected, that the images were all in the right place, that kind of thing. We're expecting them to do that with the EPUBs as well now. Whereas in the old world, we didn't worry too much about that. We just pushed the EPUB out. So we've really moved the kind of quality processes we had in the print world. We're trying to move those into the e-world as well, and have someone look at it, because that's what our consumers were doing, and they were the people finding the issues. They were looking at it on their Kindle and saying, well, this looks terrible, or this image is missing, or I can't read this text, or it's all rendered into a strange kind of font or whatever. And, we started having to unpick where these things had gone wrong. So now we have the production editors and content services as well looking at the EPUBs on devices, on screen, to actually try and head some of those problems off. And, that's a big change. It's a big workload burden, obviously. But the whole driver of this is to get that Cambridge quality that we have in print into the ebooks. And therefore, we've taken the view that that's something we want to invest in. We'll save the money on the automation, but someone has to go through and look at this and make sure it's worked before we push it out to the world. That's the goal.
Mm-hmm. And that commitment to that way of working, and that commitment and level of comfort, and frankly level of in-house expertise that they have to be able to do this, is one very strong reason why I recommended what I did for them. I do want to make one other comment that gets back to the question about XHTML versus JATS bits. In most areas of publishing, I would hazard to say virtually every other area of publishing, there isn't something that's well established. Maybe with technical documentation and DocBook, I would say is maybe analogous, but for educational publishing, there isn't anything like JATS bits NLM. There is no existing master model. All of those publishers, Cengage, Pearson, Wiley, McGraw-Hill, they've all got different models, and they're not based on the same model under the hood. You guys take it for granted that you've got this because NLM is so well embedded into this environment. But trade book publishing doesn't have anything like that. Textbook publishing doesn't have anything like that.
Well, it's a great thing to end your session on, because we're about to to move on to phase into Bruce, who, of course, is a great NML person, and is also, everybody's had to stay because of what Evan said. Evan said the post-publication part of your talk was from Bruce, as I understand it. So, Bruce, could you come forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you.